So I got a cool card from a coworker who kind of enjoys my art, and it says, "Brent, thank you so much for the painting of my cat. I can't believe how good it is, given the quality of pictures you had to work with. It sits in our living room, and everyone in our family has commented on it." That was nice. So I guess I should show you how I made this painting, right? Let's get started. So I had a 5x7 Gessobord that I put some absorbent ground on to make the surface a bit more rough. That's so I could use PanPastels for the background. And then I plan on using water pencils for the cat. But first, I spent quite a bit of time drawing the cat with a pen. I've been using this Fude pen for quite a while now because I really like the ink and the variety of lines I can get with the nib. I'm going to show you more of the drawing phase here because it was a really important thing to slow down and get everything in the right place. I mean, I usually do trees and mountains, and for those I can go a bit faster and looser and still make it look believable. But I won't be able to do that here. In fact, to make sure I got it really right, I projected this picture onto the panel and used some light pencil lines for the guides before doing this pen work, which was all by hand. I've drawn and painted a few dogs, but never a cat. The hair and whiskers kind of intimidate me, but I think I can figure it out. I took my time drawing it, and I decided to show you most of the process so you could get a feel for how slow and careful I went. Sometimes I like to go fast and loose with my sketching, and other times I like to slow it down and make a more deliberate image. I knew I was going to give this painting away, so I wanted to do a good job with it, but with the intention of doing it for free, it removed a lot of pressure that I would have felt if it was a paid commission. The woman did end up giving me a nice gift in return, but while drawing it, I was free to explore and make the painting however I wanted to do it. That was nice. You'll notice this pen can do some really thick lines and some really thin lines. The ink is also somewhat water soluble, so it will be fairly easy to blend when I need to, and when I add color later. You already know that I love pencils, but I like trying other mediums as well, and I've decided I'm not going to be a pencil purist, and I'll embrace doing mixed media pieces from here on out, as I continue to explore art in many different ways. There is no one right way to do art, and my intent on showing you my approach is just to give you some ideas for things you might want to try. I'm constantly trying to get better at creating art pieces, and for that reason, I pretty much consider every one of these attempts as practice. But knowing this will be going to someone else, it's helping me to remember to practice doing my best. Other times, I practice on just exploring. After the drawing, I'm ready to add some color, and these are called PanPastels, and I'm using this scrap paper to try to mix a color I like before putting it down for real. The cat's eyes are a beautiful blue color, and I mixed a ultramarine blue with a turquoise color from a pan you can't quite see, and I think I got a color I kind of like, so here goes nothing. Since the eyes are spheres, I put some light on one side and eventually will darken the other side. Also, to help with the color harmony of the entire painting, I'm using some leftover blue for the rest of the face too. As for the background, I'm not going to follow the photograph, but instead I'll use this bluish color there too. I'm choosing a bluish color because I think it's good contrast for the browns and maybe a little bit of orange in the cat. It takes some courage to deviate from a photo, but it's more important to me to add elements to make the piece look more like a painting than a photo. I'm adding some dark violet and light magenta colors to give it some variety. I like these pastels because they cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Much easier than if I would have just used pencils. You'll notice that I used both a light ultramarine and a dark ultramarine for that distant background. I'm trying to get a loose impressionistic look, so it looks more like air than a wall. I'm not too worried about staying within the lines either, or outside of the lines in this case, because I know I can erase it in later stages. Either way, I don't really want that cat tower thing to be part of the image, so I'm keeping things soft, so it appears the cat is lying on something, but it's up to the viewer to decide what it is. This is a kneaded eraser, and I haven't found anything else that works as well at lifting off big areas of colors as this does. An electric eraser works too, but that is better for finer details and smaller spots. Unfortunately, the kneaded eraser doesn't lift off the pen marks, so that's good. I also decided to keep using the pan pastel for the underpainting color of the cat too. I'm going slower here as I look at the reference photo to make sure I capture the right patterns that are on the face. If you don't know this already, drawing can be a really relaxing and enjoyable hobby, and I'm having fun doing this. In fact, I spent about 5 more minutes with the pastels before I broke out the water-soluble pencils, which I'll use to get some of the finer details that I can't quite get with these pastel sponges, at least not on a smaller scale or size of this painting. So I've obviously sped up some of this for you, but I wanted to show you that it takes some time to establish the right dark and light values, which for me is really important to establish before getting caught up in the details, especially since I'm not trying to perfectly match this photo. I'm just using some impressionistic marks to represent what I'm observing in the photo. And I think it'll make for a more interesting painting. And now I'm finally starting to draw and paint with the water-soluble pencils. The way I'm using these on this cat portrait is a departure from how I usually use these pencils. Since I used the PanPastel to lay down all that color, I won't be doing the big washes with water for the underpainting. That part is done. So I'm just going to do more precise drawing strokes. I'll still use a wet brush for blending, but it will be a smaller one. I mentioned early on that I wasn't sure how I would handle getting the cat's fur and whiskery hair textures. I guess now is the time to figure it out. Spending this much time staring at the photo really helps me to observe the different characteristics that I'm seeing. It's a pretty cat, and the eyes are very pretty. Her name was Sky, in honor of the blue eyes. Since I painted the entire eye blue earlier, now is my chance to redarken that pupil. After looking for so long, it was interesting to observe that the pupil on my left was shaped more like the normal vertical slit that you think of when you think of a cat eye, but that right pupil was more round. A little reading about this, I learned that when a cat's pupil dilates, it can reveal a bit about their mood. Even though I never really met this cat, I feel like I know her a bit better after spending a few hours painting her. I'm using museum aquarelle pencils here, and they are highly pigmented, and the saturation and coverage of this Prussian blue color I'm using will really pop when I wet it. I'm avoiding just using black because I think the dark blue blending with some of the browns will look more vibrant. While I have this darker color out, I'll look for other places of the face that appear the most dark. Establishing the darkest darks will help me have a good reference point for the value scale of the rest of the colors. It's easy when drawing in details to draw everything too lightly and tentatively, so getting the darks dark enough is one of the best tips I've ever learned. For this foot, it was kind of hard to tell whose paw it was. Was it the cat on the left or the right? So I pretty much guessed, and I just aimed to draw something that looked about right. Since I don't want that foot to be the center of attention, I'm okay if it's loosely represented. That's why I try to keep those eyes with the sharpest lines and edges, and the paw will have much softer edges. Now that I'm adding water, I'm careful not to use too much water so the pigment doesn't spread around and ruin the sharpness of the lines. Adding the water makes the color look darker, but it will lighten as it dries. But even when it does lighten, it will still look darker than before wetting it, simply because spreading the pigment out removes any visible white from the surface underneath it. The water brush was adding more water than I wanted, and because I want to avoid any blooms as the water dries, I'm using the tip of this paper towel to sop up any excess water, while hoping it doesn't lift too much pigment with it. It was difficult to control the water flow with that water brush, so I decided to use a regular brush. And I'll dip it in the water cup so I can use less water and reduce the spread of the water. I'm kind of learning as I go here. The eyes are the star of the show, so I'm spending a lot of time on them. And you'll notice I don't just have dark blue here, but I also have a brown color for the eyelids. It's interesting how the pastel underneath blends with the pencil colors. Not only does the pastel blend okay with itself, I find it blends well with the pencils. I think it's a great combination, actually. Even though the sponge application of the pastel made some very soft edges, the water on this brush adds some textured lines, which I think helps the fur feel more real. Plus, I think it was helpful that there is some residual pigment on the brush as I blend it around. It feels like it's producing some unexpected effects. That is one thing I like about using water. It has a life of its own, even when it's not too much water on the brush. If you remember, I used a dark Prussian view and it's blending with the burnt sienna and yellow ochre colors that I used in the pastels. And again, I think the brush strokes are adding a nice texture. More to come though on adding textures. For that I have a few tricks up my sleeve. As it relates to the pan pastels, the company says you can blend pastel with water, but they recommend diluting alcohol with the water rather than straight water. That probably makes sense when using paper, but I'm finding that the absorbent ground I put on the surface is soaking up the water pretty well and drying really quickly. But then again, I don't have much water here. At this stage, I'm sort of mixing the colors directly on the painting with the water. The strokes are pretty impressionistic, and admittedly, I'm still experimenting a bit to see what the wet brush will create, and I'll add more pencil marks in a bit. I haven't really seen anyone else paint this way. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it seems like a pretty cool way to paint. I'm not saying you should do it my way, but I will say, don't be afraid to experiment and explore with your art supplies. You might discover something you really like. I'm going back into those blue eyes now with the pencil to try to add some depth and roundness to the eye. Similar to drawing a sphere, one side is darker than the other because the way the light hits it. It's the same with those eyes. I'll add some white highlights later. I always say that I have a new trick for adding white back into my paintings, and soon you'll see that new approach that I haven't used before. So I'm going back and forth between pencil and brush from here on out. Part of that back and forth is adding a variety of color, as well as dark and light values. I think I surprised myself with the patience I had in doing this. I think that's one thing I like about working with smaller pieces. 5 by 7 inches seems just about perfect for this one, not too big and not too small. These final pencil marks are getting darker, and I'll blend them less and less because the pencil marks themselves help with the texture of the hair. This brush is not very wet, and I'm just softening the marks a little. Even though they are called watercolor pencils, I don't try to make this look like a watercolor painting. The texture of the pencils has a unique look that can't be achieved any other way, and I think it's good to play to the strength of the pencils. Okay, I have the battery-powered eraser now. You've seen me use that before, and I'm using the smallest size eraser that I have for it, because the details are smaller. It's working okay for the bigger whiskers and highlights, and even some of the wider tufts of hair. In fact, with some parts of this, it's as if I'm painting with the eraser now. And this big brush is completely dry. I'm just using it to brush out the crumbs the eraser left. And this razor blade is the new trick. The fine point of the knife is obviously finer than that eraser could be, and because the surface is super durable, I'm able to scratch the color off down to the white of that absorbent ground I use. I'm not digging so deep that I go down to the board itself though. I'm just using light enough pressure to get the white marks. Kinda cool. I'm trying hard to keep the whiskers random and of different lengths. And those chin hairs are really short, but they're also random and uneven looking. And there are also more white eyebrow hairs and ear hairs poking up and out. So this is another good way to do the hair texture. It's also good for small variations in the fur. I knew I wasn't going to be patient enough to paint around the white hairs, so I'm glad scraping and erasing from the dark spots is an option. I took my time with this stage as well. But wait, there's more. White pastel is sort of opaque too, and it can leave softer lines. The razor and eraser left some really sharp white lines, but this pastel helped with some of the other softer highlights. And I didn't just use white, I used some lighter tints of the yellow and burnt sienna. And even added in a touch of dark tones while I had the pastels out to make that nose look fuller. I'm also going to go back and forth again with the pencil textures. And in doing the finishing touches on this, they spread out over a few days actually, because I'd like to work on it a little and then walk away from it, and then I'd look at it for a long time and do a few changes. I kept looking at it with fresh eyes. And I think it's good to be able to walk away from a painting or stand back and to try to see it with fresh eyes to see what you might want to change. At one point, I even signed it thinking I was done, and then decided to change it a bit more, especially that background. I decided to make it look more like the cat was resting on a pillow rather than floating in space. But I finally called it good and put a coat of spray varnish on it to protect it, and then gave it away. I'm really glad she liked it, and I loved doing it, and was really proud of the results. I think I even surprised myself. Subscribe if you think this is helpful. It might also help me get noticed by others that might like it too. Thanks for exploring art with me.